Yeah, I didn't think about that at all. I just dropped other classes. I was like, this is too much. I added like this marriage and family class for one of my things, but it doesn't start until October. Dropped
More jazz.
I was gonna take it, but it was organized like the first week was organized into 2 modules, and they had due dates, and it was just really bad. And then I found out they were just randomly like 2 quizzes due, and I was like, this is I don't like this teacher. They had nothing to do with the content. I swear, just searching the class layouts force you to like fail if you have bad willpower.
All right, how's it going? Going good? Seems like we're missing a day drop. Maybe I changed the majors. Okay, the anti-recruiter. All right, so day 2, and what we're going to do today, again, like I said, we meet 8 to 9, and we're going to get into the lecture portion of the class, and then take a break, and then we'll do the lab stuff. Today for lab, there were some people yesterday who asked about this and that and whatever. There's a lot we haven't yet done in lab. Finish that. So today, I think everyone's at the point where you've created your tree on a little target diagram. So we'll give you a little bit of time to kind of come up with an idea, and then we're going to put all of the trees on the board, and then I'll show you how you can use the results of the tree to come up with your names of genus and family groupings, etc. So there was no expectation that you were going to have all the names by today. That is due, I think I said I'm due Monday night, due basically before the class next Tuesday. So you'll have all weekend to think about it, right? And I'll give you some ideas of how to do that today. All right, and then next week we're going to jump right into diversity. So on Tuesday we'll look at the protists. On Thursday we'll look at the sponges, and we're just going to crank on with topics here. All right. So last time we finished up with, I think we talked about what pseudoscience was, and how pseudoscience essentially is. It happens all over the place. It's not just things like Bigfoot and UFOs. It's things as simple as, does a bird species like the ivory bill woodpecker still exist, or does a herbal supplement like echinacea really help your health? Pseudoscience is all around. So what I want to encourage is you to think about is those researchers that question whether giraffes have long necks that can reach high up into the trees. After at least 200 years of that being the textbook explanation, someone finally, measured it or tested the hypothesis. And lo and behold, it just didn't shake out, right? I gave you some reasons why that wasn't a good explanation. And so the cool thing about a scientific inquiry is there are no sacred hypotheses. If you find evidence that a hypothesis is wrong, it's wrong, right? And you basically modify or adapt or change your explanation. So that being said, we're going to go ahead and talk quite a bit about the origins and development of hypotheses and theories of evolution. And what you'll see is that basically, as new information comes up, essentially kind of the model or hypotheses for how evolution works have changed over the last couple hundred years. So our story starts with this person, Jean Lamarck. And it's a real brief kind of story about Jean Lamarck. Jean Lamarck, this is in late 1700s, early 1800s. 1809 is when Jean Lamarck kind of published his thoughts on a mechanism for evolution. So anyway, you're on the hook for knowing who Jean Lamarck was. He was a French, military officer, kind of a wealthy aristocrat kind of guy, and had a kind of a hobby interest in natural history, animals and plants, etc. And so Jean Lamarck, we talk about him because Jean Lamarck came up with, he wasn't the first person to come up with the idea that organisms evolve or change over time. He's the first person that came up with a mechanism that was testable of how organisms change over time. And the best way to describe, that you have to know for the test, the best way to describe what Jean Lamarck said is acquired traits. I mean, that's probably the kind of most concise way to think about what Jean Lamarck said. Here's how it goes. This is the way acquired traits works. You need to know this for the test. Is that, so like for example, Jean Lamarck used giraffes as his explanation. And Jean Lamarck proposed that, look at the giraffes with their long necks. What's happening is, way back in evolutionary history, shorter giraffes were reaching up higher into the trees, like they were kind of stretching their necks, straining. There was that strain that happens, and that strain causes a physiological change in the giraffe's offspring, such that the offspring will end up with slightly longer necks because of their parental strain. And over many, many generations, that reaching up into the tree strain has caused the giraffe to have longer necks. And then Lamarck also uses examples like, look at the blacksmith's children. Blacksmiths were, they'd forge things with hammers on anvils, etc. That the blacksmith's children tend to be really strong and kind of stocky people. And so he used this as kind of evidence for this, what he called acquired traits. Basically, the strain or experience of a parent is passed down to the offspring as a change in their traits. Okay, so the cool thing about this was that it was testable, right? So they did things like they would take mice and put them in cold boxes, and then see if the offspring had more hair, or they would do like we were talking about strength tests on organisms and see if the offsprings had a change in their physiological strength, etc. And probably by about the 1820s, it didn't work. Like, it was basically a hypothesis that was never supported. And essentially, because it was testable and falsifiable, it kind of fell out of favor, and it basically was rejected. So Lamarck was wrong, right? Like, his hypothesis about acquired traits didn't work. Essentially, it was not correct. It was wrong, the way to think about things. And so I guess the question is, why are we talking about him, right? He's wrong. Shouldn't we just kind of forget about him? No. What I like about Lamarck is we have an early example of a scientific hypothesis. It was scientific because it was testable and falsifiable, and it was tested and it was falsified, right? So I think Lamarck deserves credit for at least coming up with, a pushing into the scientific inquiry of evolutionary change. I remember when I was in college, and the story of Lamarck came up. It was almost like, it was kind of silly because he was talking about like Lamarck was a buffoon. Like he didn't get it, he missed it and all that stuff. And looking back now, I think, wow, it's pretty bold for someone to come up with a hypothesis and then have it be tested and rejected. But what it did was it led to further inquiry that was testable and falsifiable. So that's important, okay? And, Lamarck got his revenge. Recently, there is a whole field of genetics and kind of an inheritance theory that that is called epigenetics. So this area of what's called epigenetics, I want to talk about this. Is kind of cool. This is really cool. Epigenetics is a pretty recent scientific field. I don't even think your textbook even talks about epigenetics. It's so current. Anyway, here's the story of epigenetics. It kind of came from when human genome research was possible, right? Like in the last 20 years, we were able to take, people's DNA and sequence it and look at your genome profile. And especially like in the last 5 years, you can order your 23andMe or your Ancestry.com, spit in the test tube, and you can have your DNA profile, compared for all kinds of health issues and traits. And you can get your results back like in like a month. They cost like what, $50 or something. It's amazing, right? It's amazing technology. Anyway, early on in human gene profiling, the country of Iceland. Iceland is that country in the North Atlantic, kind of northwest of Ireland and England. And Iceland has a so anyway, what Iceland did, it's a small population, relatively small population, and Icelanders, I don't know if anyone here is from Iceland or has Icelandic heritage, but they have a real kind of a nationalistic pride of their kind of Viking heritage, and so Icelanders had kind of obsessively tracked their family lineage, and they were very proud of being able to trace their ancestors back to specific Vikings or figures that occurred long ago. So they had really good genealogies and really good family trees established in a small population. So the country of Iceland actually funded a nationwide genome project where everyone could provide DNA samples and they would have their DNA profile. And they found some really interesting information. So in Iceland, they had a famine back in kind of the late 1800s and early 1900s. The same famine that happened in Ireland, the potato famine, I think it was like it was a potato virus. It was a virus that obliterated the potato crop in Ireland. Also happened in Iceland. And so there was a famine where people starved to death or people nearly starved to death, kind of in 1890s, 1910 zone. Anyway, what they found was people whose great-grandparents had almost starved to death, like had lost a lot of body mass because they nearly starved from the famine. Those people tend to have a higher body mass index, like they were heavier, they retained more fat in their body than people whose ancestors, great-grandparents, did not almost starve to death. And so that was an interesting result from this Iceland study. And what it says is that, I mean, if you think about it, if you starve to death, you somehow pass some genetic information off to your offspring that says store more body fat to be prepared for famine, right? That's kind of the idea. And so this field of epigenetics is really relatively new, and it's basically kind of implying that some of what Lamarck suggested was true, right? It's just that I think at the time, the acquired traits, Lamarck was kind of looking at it more in terms like of an evolutionary, evolutionary change of species. But in terms of population change, there's definitely some evidence that environmental exposure or your response to your environment can be passed on to your offspring. So anyway, Lamarck wasn't totally wrong. It's just that he really didn't know what this was all about. It's just kind of a coincidence. But I think it's still worth talking about Lamarck because it was probably the first testable mechanism for evolutionary change. Even though it didn't work out, it's kind of set the stage for how science was going to go in the 1800s until the 1900s. Gotcha? Okay, so the person that we talk about most with regards the history of evolution or evolutionary theory, of course, is Charles Darwin. Interestingly enough, Charles Darwin was born in 1809, the same year that Lamarck published his book, right? So that was just kind of a total coincidence. Charles Darwin shares the exact same birthday as Abraham Lincoln, so it's kind of interesting. Just trying to think about the timing, like when this all happened, right? So anyway, Charles Darwin was born 1809, the same year Lamarck. Let me go ahead and put a date on this Lamarck thing. And I'm not going to expect you to remember a date, but it kind of puts it into kind of perspective of when these things kind of all happened, right? So anyway, Charles Darwin was born, so what I want to point out here also is Lamarck and Darwin were perfect examples of the kind of people who could do science or who were doing science at the time. If you think about like in the 1700s, 1800s, we talked a little bit about Carl Linnaeus. We'll mention him again today. He was that Swiss botanist that came up with the binomial nomenclature system. That was in the 1750s or so. Lamarck was a military officer and kind of aristocrat. Darwin was Darwin's father and grandfather were doctors and surgeons in England. So what we're talking about is like rich kids, right? Like these are people who had basically family money. They didn't really need to worry about making a living on their own. So they had the free time to go, look into natural history and write articles about this and kind of spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff. Okay, so and then down the road we'll talk about people like Mendel who were monks, etc. But I think it's really interesting to think about the people who were doing science kind of in the 1700s and 1800s. I mean, they were kind of privileged people, right? And it's kind of cool that now pretty much anyone who has the interest could pursue science. So this is kind of a different time. So anyway, Darwin's father was a pretty famous surgeon, and Darwin's grandfather was also a doctor. Darwin's grandfather actually wrote about evolution. His family was kind of interested. They liked hunting and fishing and taking walks in the woods, collecting flowers and things. So there was a very, very naturalist kind of family. And Darwin's grandfather actually wrote an essay about evolution and organismal change. So it was kind of a family hobby or interest to look into natural history and biology. So anyway, Darwin, kind of following in his father and grandfather's interest footsteps, was a real avid outdoors person, liked to go hiking and collect rocks, and collect insects and flowers, etc. Loved hunting, bird hunting especially. And so when Darwin was, probably about 17 or 18 years old, of course he went to boarding schools, like kids did. And his father wrote him a letter and said, I fear that you're going to kind of come to nothing, like you just go out hunting and fishing all the time, and you don't really have any aspirations to do anything. And so anyway, taking that, Darwin enrolled into medical school because he thought, well, I'll become a doctor like my parents, grandfather and grandfather. Anyway, Darwin dropped out of medical school because when he took the anatomy class, he fainted at the sight of dead body and blood. So he realized that he was probably not cut out to be a doctor or a surgeon. So he decided that he was going to enter into
a seminary school. He was going to become basically a pastor or when he wrote to his dad, he said, I'm going to become a pastor in a small country church, and then I will be able to have my week free to go hunting and fishing and collect flowers, and then work up a sermon for the weekend, and it would be great. But at his college, his advisor, his teacher or tutor at Cambridge College, said, whoa, wait a second. You're a talented naturalist. You're a talented natural history person. You're very, very good at identifying plants and animals. I think you should, before you go into ministry school, you should consider this opportunity of going on this royal expedition. And what was going on here was the British Navy was very, very active at the time, the Royal Navy, and they had a geographical expedition plan where the ship, the Beagle, the HMS Beagle, Her Majesty's ship, His Majesty's ship, sorry, the Beagle, was the king at the time. This was a geographical expedition where they were going to spend about 5 or 6 years sailing around the globe, going to various ports and colonies, doing mapping and diplomatic relations, etc. And so Darwin's tutor or teacher said, they need someone like you on the ship. But what's interesting is that they didn't need a naturalist. And so the story there is that the Royal Navy had kind of a class issue. And if you think about also what happened in the 1800s was, especially in England, but it happened in America also, is there was no middle class. It was like either you were, wealthy aristocrat or royalty, that kind of, super wealthy people, or you were just dirt poor, right? And there was nothing in between. And there was basically no middle class, like we kind of have in recent times. So anyway, the captain of the Beagle, Captain Fitzroy, he was from essentially a line with his father and grandfather were Royal Navy captains, officers. And so he came from an aristocratic, actually kind of associated with the royalty family. And the deal is the captain of the ship was from usually an aristocratic background, and everyone else on the ship basically were in the Navy, so they wouldn't be completely real poor, right? Like Navy was kind of one option to get out of poverty because you basically had everything to pay for it. So because of the class structure at the time, like people who were aristocratic, wealthy people in royalty just didn't associate or talk to poor people. And so there was a problem apparently in the Royal Navy of like depression and mental health issues with captains. Because they go out to sea, they'd be months at a time sailing in the ocean. And the captain basically spoke to one person, the first officer. Like once or twice a day, the first officer would get orders or briefs. And then the officer would disseminate those orders to the crew. But the captain basically only spoke to one person a couple times a day. Otherwise, they're just sitting in their cabin, looking at maps and writing journals and what have you. So Fitzroy's father had, in a bout of depression, had killed himself on a voyage. And so Fitzroy's family was really worried about him, because he was kind of showing some signs of being a little having problems. And so Fitzroy's family put out that they would like a suitable aristocratic class level companion for the captain to have on the voyage. Basically someone who would meet with the captain for dinner, have conversations, essentially be the captain's buddy, on the ship. And And so that is what Darwin signed up for. So what I want to do now, and that's kind of like setting the stage for this, is I want to go through this voyage of the Beagle. There's going to be like about 6 different points of interest on this 5-year, sailing trip around the globe. But one thing a lot of people don't realize is, people think that Darwin was brought on to the Beagle to be the naturalist. He wasn't. He was actually brought on to the Beagle to be the ship's dinner buddy and companion, so that the captain's dinner buddy, so the captain didn't have, problems with depression. So what I want to do is I'm going to list out some stops, and we're going to kind of go through this voyage of the Beagle. But what's interesting about this is you can kind of see how Darwin came up with how his theory of evolutionary change kind of developed or emerged over time. And it wasn't like a sudden poof, aha, I have a great idea. It was a long time coming and a lot of information that was put together over about 25 years actually. But the 5-year voyage of the Beagle definitely was the beginning of the process. So I'm going to list out some stops here, and we'll get an idea of what's going on here. So number 1, I think we're looking here at 1832. And again, I'm not going to worry about 1831. I'm not going to worry about you remembering dates. Don't worry about dates. I know our history class is a pain in the neck. But just to kind of give you a perspective of when this is all happening. Darwin was only like 20 years old, so he was a very, very young person. Okay, so we are in England. So this is our first kind of important place here is in England. And Darwin basically ends up on the HMS basically means like His Majesty's ship. It's kind of like a Navy ship being USS whatever, United States ship. So HMS Beagle. Which was the Royal Geographic ship. And the reason Darwin was on this ship, which you should know for the test, is he was the Captain Fitzroy's dinner buddy. And so Darwin was not actually the approved legitimate naturalist on the ship. That job was the ship's surgeon. And so the ship's surgeon, the ship's doctor, medical officer, was usually given the role of collecting natural history specimens and documenting, biology observations, etc. So Darwin had no duties on the ship, and that was actually Darwin's request. Darwin said, "I'll do this. I'm not joining the Navy." And Darwin basically said that he was going to pay all of his own expenses. Like he paid for all of his own supplies and resources. And Darwin requested, or basically insisted, that when the ship was at port, anchored up, that Darwin was free to go do whatever he wanted to do. He had no duties associated with the ship at all. His only responsibility was when they were at sea, that he would essentially meet with the captain for tea and for dinner, and that was kind of his role. Otherwise, he had complete independence on the ship. Okay, so they take off 1831, and they begin sailing down the western coast of Europe here, western coast of Africa, and our first stop here is the Cape Verde Islands of Santiago or St. Iago here. And let's go ahead and let's see here. The island of St. Iago or Santiago is our first stop. So if you look this up or follow along and you also listen to me, you'll hear me kind of say different names. So I'm going to go ahead and try to write down a variety of names here. These are the Cape Verde Islands. And it's sometimes called, St. Iago or Santiago, is the Spanish way to say that, right? But just, doesn't really matter. I'm not going to require that you remember that. Usually on the test, I'll have the locations kind of listed out already. It's just that you remember what Cape Verde Islands or St. Iago is. Anyway, they show up to St. Iago, these islands off the coast of Africa, and there's a volcano erupting. It's a volcanic island. And at the time, the volcano was spewing ash and smoke out of the volcanic cone. And this was cool. Darwin had read in geology books about volcanoes, but never seen one. And so he was fascinated by this, and so it's kind of a totally new thing. So when they came to the island, Darwin got off the island. And one thing I need to mention is there's a couple books that really influenced Darwin. And so there's two books especially that I want you to know. One's associated with this stop. Is you have to realize there was a major change in science at the time. Like the transition from the late 1700s into the early 1900s, there was a massive change in how science was explained and interpreted. Prior to 1800s, so like in the 1600s and 1700s, most geological or biological observations and even chemistry stuff were very, very kind of intertwined with religious doctrine. Like if you think about in chemistry, you probably in chemistry know that the Kelvin scale, right? Kelvin is like how you measure temperature in chemistry. Lord Kelvin in the mid-1700s was a chemist, and his whole thing was he was trying to prove that the Earth was less than 6,000 years old based on cooling. So part of Kelvin's temperature themes was he was trying to prove the age of the Earth according to biblical stories. And then Linnaeus, Carl Linnaeus, who did all the naming, the binomial nomenclature thing. Linnaeus basically was, essentially he felt like his role was to document the wonder of creation, all of the species that were created, etc. And but in 1800, there would seem to be kind of a shift in science where there became more of, I guess, what you'd call a naturalistic explanation. There was kind of a detachment from everything being kind of a theistic explanation and to be more of a naturalistic explanation. And Charles Lyell, who wrote a book called Principles of Geology in the early 1800s, had a huge influence on Darwin. So let's go ahead and take a look here. What influenced Darwin here is Lyell's Principles of Geology. Now, Lyell, this was a revolutionary geology book. I think it was published in 1820 or so. But anyway, Lyell kind of broke from the catastrophist geologists before. So geology before was usually kind of centered around describing landforms based on the biblical flood stories, like the flood from the Old Testament, must have flooded the world, and after water drained, all these erosion and valleys and canyons, etc., were formed. And geologists, in the 1600s and 1700s were kind of trying to support that with observations. Lyell broke from that and kind of said, the processes that form the Earth, erosion, mountain building, coastline forming, etc., they're still happening today. It's just that it happens so slowly over such a long period of time that we can't see it. But if you think about how long this has been happening, you know, canyons and cliffs and coastlines and mountains are all formed by very, very slow processes that happen over a long period of time. So what Lyell proposed was that the Earth must be much older than 6,000 years, for example. And, you know, Lyell proposed the Earth was millions of years old. Now the estimate is the Earth's about 4.5 billion years old, which, I don't think Lyell really had a conception of that kind of age for time. But the important thing is this principles of geology set the stage of minuscule changes, very small changes over a long period of time can end up resulting in very, very grand or great, features. So the idea here is that, a volcanic eruption like this can be interpreted in terms of the coastline. So Darwin, this is a map of, this is actually from Darwin. Darwin wrote a book called Volcanic Islands, and this is a diagram from that book. And he's on St. Iago. And what he noticed was as he kind of hiked in towards the volcanic cones, he saw different kinds of rock layers on the coastline. So as they got off the ship, basically there were kind of lower ancient volcanic rocks down by the coast, like ancient volcanic rocks down here. And then a little bit more inland, he found what he calls calcareous stratum, but that's limestone. And calcareous stratum limestone is actually produced by the remnants of corals or coral reefs. Limestone is actually made by marine organisms that leave their remnants. This is up on basically the cliffs where limestone. And then farther in, he saw upper basaltic rock, which was being produced by the volcano at the time. So you can kind of think of this, and this is how I'm going to summarize this. In the island of St. Iago, he saw kind of like a volcanic limestone sandwich. So he found basically volcanic layers and limestone layers that were kind of alternating. And that indicated to Darwin that, this is kind of how I interpret it, is that this island or this area was much different over history than what you see today. Like today you're seeing a volcanic eruption, but in the past there would have been coral reefs that were forming. But then prior to that, there was volcanic activity that was happening as well. So what Darwin basically is saying is this kind of confirmed what Lyell is saying is these processes that are forming this island, they're still happening, like the volcano's erupting, but it has kind of changed and alternated and happened over such a long period of time that we see, these grand landforms, as they are today. It didn't all just happen in one catastrophic moment. It happened over a long period of time by very, very slow process. So the importance of stop 2 is the island of St. Iago is it confirmed this idea of long, minuscule changes that result kind of in these grand features that we see at this time. This volcano limestone sandwich in the geology happened over many, probably millions and millions of years, which was counter to the prior ideas, which was everything kind of spontaneously happened by some theistic explanation. Okay. So the next stop here. So and I'm kind of shortcutting this whole thing, but we go from the island of St. Iago, which is off the coast of Africa, kind of near the Canary Islands. They cross the equator, and I'm going to kind of combine together a bunch of stories that happened along the eastern coast of South America. They land in Brazil, and then they kind of end up going down through Argentina, what's now Argentina. That's sort of like these next. I'll just call it Brazil, but there we go. So they end up in Brazil, and along the eastern coast of South America. And you got to imagine, that Brazil is, where probably the most lush, diverse tropical rainforest is in the world. So, Brazil, Amazon, right? So they end up in Brazil, or the east coast of South America, and here we're seeing tropical rainforest. And in this tropical rainforest, you got to imagine someone who grew up in England, where the climate is like Seattle, right? Kind of overcast and gray and dreary and always drizzling and cold. To end up in the tropical rainforest must have just been like being on a different planet. So he gets off the ship, goes into the tropical rainforest. Didn't take long because it was like, within a few hundred feet, he was deep in this tropical rainforest. And this is what Darwin wrote about this in his journal, or his autobiography. It was impossible to wish for anything more delightful than thus to spend some weeks in so magnificent a country. In England, any person fond of natural history enjoys in his walks a great advantage by always having something to attract his attention. But in these fertile climates, teeming with life, the attractions are so numerous that he's scarcely able to walk at all. So anyway, Darwin was overwhelmed by the diversity. And he came to the conclusion that it was, the warm climate, plenty of water, fertile climates, meaning lots of nutrients, lots of habitats. What he noticed here was that the increased amount of resources resulted in an increase in species diversity that was occupying these resources. So there is another book that was important. So this is the second book at Brazil, and Thomas Malthus was a famous economist, a British economist. And if you've taken economics or civics, you've probably heard of like Malthusian economics, which is like supply and demand economics, and you've probably heard those terms. That was all Thomas Malthus, a really super important, famous economist at the time. And so Malthus wrote a book that was super influential, and it really influenced Darwin. It was called On Populations. And Malthus was talking about human populations. He wasn't talking about, insects and plants. But Malthus's On Populations basically came up with a really, really important premise that we still kind of use today when talking about economics. So here's what Malthus kind of came. I'm going to draw a graph of this. Malthus kind of came up with this basic premise for why human populations go through the cycles they do. And the cycles he talks about is like populations are established, they grow, and then there's conflict. And usually we end up with things like famines and wars and depletion of resources. And Malthus was looking at the history of humans, that like we always have these kind of boom and bust cycles of populations of humans. And he explained it this way. He said over time, on the x-axis, we have basically, let me go ahead and let me mark this here, is, that, so resources, this is a double white line here. So the resources, resources would be things like agricultural planting. A community or a population would need to have food resources. And you imagine food is planted in terms of like acres, right? Or hectares or whatever it is you want to use. But so when populations are growing, usually agricultural plantings will like double every year or every generation. So we'll go from like, 10 acres, 20 acres, 40 acres, 60 acres, whatever, 80 acres. You basically double your kind of agricultural crop planting over time. So what Malthus said was that over time, resources grow geometrically, meaning like crop plantings or mining or fisheries. Basically, you increase them kind of in a geometric, meaning like you basically just kind of double it every season or every year or generation or what have you. But you have kind of like a geometric increase in resources. But he said that human populations grow exponentially. That human populations will do this because we have exponential growth. Basically, you have like 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. You have kind of like this exponential growth that happens with human populations. And so what Malthus said was, when resources are abundant, it allows populations to thrive. But when populations outgrow the resources, that's when you have like famine, conflict, wars, etc. Right? And so this is what explains kind of this boom and bust history of human populations. So Malthus's book on populations had a huge influence on Darwin's appreciation or thoughts with regard to what happened in Brazil. When resources and habitats are abundant, organisms will basically specialize to fill those resources and occupy the resources as best they can. When resources are limited, organisms have to basically compete for those resources. And that was kind of setting the stage for later on with natural selection. Okay? So what you need to know at Brazil is Malthus's on population was kind of confirmed, or was a major theme for how Darwin interpreted tropical rainforest resource abundance. Got it? Okay. On down to, here's kind of a global map here. We're here in Brazil and Argentina, and then they round the tip of South America. There's all kinds of fun stories that, there's actually the book, The Voyage of the Beagle, which Darwin wrote when he got back to England in 1836, was a bestseller. Like Darwin's first book he wrote when he got back was The Voyage of the Beagle, which is kind of like his autobiography of his voyage. That was a huge bestseller. And in fact, it influenced a lot of kind of seafaring novels, including Melville's Moby Dick, right? Moby Dick was kind of a famous book in the mid-1800s. Melville was hugely influenced by The Voyage of the Beagle to write that book. But anyway, up the coast of Chile, what's now Chile right now, there are some important stops there. Namely, we have some geological features. Chile is a country that's a lot like California. It's a very narrow country because you have these Patagonia mountains that are within like 50 miles of the coast. We kind of have that here. We have our coast within about 150 miles. You get to the Sierra Nevada and the Cascade Mountain range. Very similar in Chile. They have the Patagonia Mountains very, very close to the coast. So Darwin got on horseback and with a guide went up into the mountains. And you can see these kind of geological layers are actually sedimentary rocks. And what Darwin saw was up, probably a couple thousand feet up in elevation, like up on the mountaintop, which you could probably interpret was 5,000 or 6,000 feet up. He found fossils of seashells. So he found like clamshell fossils up in the higher mountaintops. And he compared those to the clams that were living down where the Beagle was anchored. And so he noted this, that basically there was these fossils of clams, and they're not the same, they're different, but he noted that there was also clams down in the ocean where the ship was anchored, and kind of made this connection. Okay, well, way up on the mountaintop, how did these clamshells get way up here? So anyway, an additional experience that Darwin had was while they were traveling. Darwin was, when he was collecting specimens, what he would do is he had a muzzle-loaded shotgun, and he would shoot birds, and they would eat the birds, they'd eat whatever they killed, and then he would preserve the pelt and the skeleton and pack it away to send back to England. So, when they found things like an armadillo, which is, a unique organism to South America and to, in America, Texas and Arizona have armadillos. He wrote, I turned the lights off so you can read this. In the morning, we had caught an armadillo, which, although a most excellent dish when roasted in its shell, did not make a very substantial breakfast and dinner for 2 hungry men. So Darwin, kind of ate his way through South America here. But because Darwin was interested in fossils, like these plant fossils, the locals who were kind of guiding him around told him, well, check this out. There's these fossils that are around. And so Darwin excavated one, and it was essentially a fossil armadillo ancestor. And it's probably from the Ice Age, from 30,000 or 60,000 years ago, this thing called a glyptodon. And it had a very similar skull feature to armadillos and a very similar shell feature. But these things were quite large. Here is the fossil of a glyptodon. And it's like the size of a cow, basically. So it was a very, very large kind of extinct armadillo ancestor or relative. And so Darwin made this association again from the clamshells on top of the mountain compared to the living ones that are by the ship, and comparing the armadillo that they killed and ate to these fossil glyptodons. Darwin wrote, "This wonderful relationship in the same continent between the dead and the living, I do not doubt, hereafter throw more light on the appearance of organic beings on our earth and their disappearance from it than any other class of facts." I mean, it's kind of a vague language, flowery language, but basically what Darwin's stating here is that organisms change over time, species change over time. He's made this connection between fossils and living organisms. So our top 4 here is Chile, and what he sees basically is fossils and living species. Okay, and his kind of awareness or thoughts that come up with this is change of organisms over time. So he's making this connection between extinct fossil organisms that resemble current living organisms, but they're distinctly physiologically different, or physically different. Got it? Okay, probably the most famous stop that most people talk about is the Galapagos Islands. And so the reason why I'm going into this whole story is to basically make it clear that it's not like Darwin showed up on the Galapagos and went, poof, evolution, This was just one stop along the way. And I would say that the Galapagos, when Darwin was there, didn't really mean anything to him. It wasn't until much later that he put kind of everything together. But this is kind of our next to final destination here that really kind of solidified Darwin's view of how things work. So they came into the Galapagos Islands from the south, and these are volcanic islands that the volcanoes were extinct, but they're about 1,000 miles off the coast of South America, off the coast of Ecuador. Even though we talk about the Galapagos finches as the primary thing, I think the first thing that Darwin saw when he came into here were these Galapagos tortoises. And so each island, basically, because they're separated by quite a distance, dozens or hundreds of miles, each island kind of was isolated from each other, but had kind of their own unique assemblage of animals and plants on there. So let me go ahead and pull, I don't have a PowerPoint of this, but the Galapagos tortoises are Galapagos giant tortoises. So these Galapagos giant tortoises, these are a tortoise that is, the shell's probably about 2 to 3 feet long. They're maybe 2 feet tall. Obviously, they're very, very slow moving. These tortoises basically kind of occupied every single one of these islands. So what would happen was when the ship came to an island, because they've been at sea for so long, there's a couple things they would do. One is they needed to get water, fresh water supply to the ship. So part of the crew would go out and get fresh water. Other members of the crew would go out and get fresh food, like fresh fruit and vegetables, and namely, if there was any animals they could collect to eat, they would do it. And so what is easier than catching tortoises, right? You basically walk out there, they can't run from you. And so what they would do is they would grab the tortoises, wouldn't have to run very fast to get them. 2 sailors could pick a tortoise up, take it back on the ship, and then they flip the tortoises on their back, so they're still alive. And that way the meat didn't spoil. Basically it was kind of like they kept the tortoises alive on their back, and then they would eat them kind of along the way. So the reason why that's important is they collected tortoises as they hit the first islands, Hispaniola and Floriana. And then when they ended up at other islands, like Island Santa Cruz, when they pulled up to the port there, the locals that were there, when they came on the ship, say, "Oh, I see you've been to Hispaniola." And Darwin was kind of curious as to how they knew where they'd been. And the locals said, "Well, you have the tortoises from that island." And what it turns out is these were all Galapagos tortoises. They were the same species. But each island tended to have kind of its own unique version of the height of the shell. Some of them were called stone shell tortoises. Some were called saddle shell tortoises because they were more flat. Kind of the coloration and the flares in the shell. The tortoises were kind of had a unique flavor for every island that they went to. And Darwin was surprised that the locals kind of would recognize the tortoises from the various islands on the site. So that was an example of each island had its own unique type of tortoise, although they were all the same species. It was the finches, or the birds, that Darwin ran into that resulted in kind of the story that you hear about from the Galapagos. So one thing that happens is in these islands, the different islands had different habitats because of how the weather came in, the rain came in. Usually what happens is the weather comes in from the west, and the west side of the Galapagos is like a tropical rainforest. It's kind of like if you've ever been to Hawaii. The Kona coast is kind of the wet side, and the Hilo coast is kind of the dry side. So the west side of the island is wet because the rain falls basically on the west side of the mountain range, and then there's a rain shadow where the eastern islands are like deserts. So that the different islands basically had kind of like tropical rainforest islands and then like desert islands over here. And what that resulted in basically was different, vegetation habitats. So on Darwin's collecting trips, he would go out and shoot birds with his shotgun and eat them, obviously. And then he would kind of preserve their pelts and skeletons and pack them up and send them back to England. And he would write notes about what type of habitat they were in and what kind of birds he thought they were. And so he thought basically he had things like the ground finches he thought were kind of like partridge. We call them quail here in America, but in Europe, partridge are their kind of ground bird. Or he thought he had like crows, like there was a crow bird. And he thought he had like a woodpecker type bird, where they were basically kind of pecking insects out of the cactus stalks. And he thought he had things like warbler type birds or sparrows. So Darwin named all the birds based on ones that he was familiar with back in England. Partridge, crows, woodpeckers, warblers, etc. But anyway, when Darwin got back to England at the end of the voyage, his professor, who was a bird expert, said, all those birds that you sent me were not crows, partridge, whatever. They're all basically in the finch family. He's like, they were all basically the same family of birds. It's just they had, obviously specialized into their feeding resource, their feeding habitat, and became kind of their own unique thing. So, so anyway, the interesting thing was because Darwin wasn't really a bird expert, he really didn't know it ahead of time. It took until he got back for his professor to tell him that these were actually all the same basic family of birds, same basic kind of bird, but they had diversified into to look like the birds that you were familiar with. So let's go ahead and do this stop. We're almost done here, and this was the Galapagos. Islands. Okay, and then here he saw species specialized to habitat for food resources. And the main thing he basically saw here was tortoises and finches as the example. Okay, they spent a couple more years traveling around Australia, traveling through the Indian Ocean, around the tip of Africa. There's all kinds of cool stories there too. But I think this is kind of enough. They end up back in England. Kind of England on the return here. And so it was a 5-year journey. This is 1831. And this is 1836 when they return. Darwin publishes the Voyage of the Beagle pretty much within a few years. He publishes a book on how coral islands form from volcanoes based on his experience in Cape Verde Islands. But it's like another 24 years or 23 years before he publishes anything about evolution. So what I say here is that in 1859 is when Darwin publishes his book, Origin of Species. And this is where he describes basically the mechanism of natural selection. So it's interesting to think about, like, why did it take Darwin so long? Isn't that 23 years or so, from 1836 to 1859? There's a couple explanations. One is Darwin was a very meticulous person. Like, he didn't just come up with half-thought ideas and release them. Supposedly, he was very kind of OCD about getting details down. So after interpreting the Galapagos finch birds, and he also ended up doing experiments with barnacles and raising raising pigeons. He was a pigeon fancier, and he studied earthworms. You know, he was doing quite a bit of research along the way, and according to his journal notes, he was kind of thinking about how organisms change, the mechanisms by which they change. It was also presumed that because Darwin was a very religious person, like, you know, he wanted to become a minister or pastor for a church, you know, prior to this voyage, was that he knew that coming up with some naturalistic explanation for how organisms change was going to be, you know, controversial. He knew that this was a very controversial thing for biology, especially based on what he knew about how Lyell's geology publication was very controversial. So he kind of held off. But the story has it was that he received a letter from another biologist in 1859 who had similar ideas of how change happens. This was a guy named Huxley. Anyway, the story has it Darwin, worried that maybe someone else would publish ideas before he did, suddenly came up with the book Origin of Species in 1859. And it was a huge controversial and a very influential book. We're pretty much done, but I think what I want to do, so on Tuesday, we'll talk about specifically what the origin of species means and what natural selection is basically saying, as Darwin described it. But I think it's worthwhile to kind of look at, this is the last sentence of the last edition of the Origin of Species. The first one was published in 1859, and then there was a total of 6 editions. So this is the last edition of the Origin of Species. But here's what Darwin said. This is kind of the best way to think about, you know, what natural selection basically means. Is there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. So the key thing here to think about is that basically what Darwin's proposing is that, you know, organisms basically change over time, and they're still changing today. It's just it's happening so slowly over such a long period of time that we can't see it on a day-to-day or generation basis. But essentially what he's doing is he's kind of parroting Lyell's explanation for geology and applying it to organisms. Also interesting to note is that this is the only use of the term evolved in the entire book. So the term evolution really didn't come until later. But that was the only use of the word evolved. But basically all that means is change over time. Also the thing to note here is that Darwin had no speculation about the origins of life, and all he's saying essentially is that organisms change over time, and diversity that we see has a natural explanation versus a theistic, spontaneous creation explanation. So anyway, we'll go ahead and talk more about Darwin on Tuesday, but I want to do one thing. One last exercise for this is, I think the best way to describe what Darwin said is this quote: "Descent with modification." So descent with modification, you know, this is kind of in contrast to Lamarck's acquired traits, right? So the best way to describe, I think, Darwin's natural selection is to say that basically populations will produce offspring with modified traits, so traits that get modified from generation to generation. And the mechanism of natural selection we'll talk about. But that's probably the best way to describe what the mechanism by which Darwin operated. Okay, you often hear this other term, and I want to get this right now, this idea of survival of the fittest, right? You probably heard this one. Survival of the fittest. Okay. Darwin never actually said this. This was a quote by an economist named Herbert Spencer. In about the 1860s, Herbert Spencer was a British economist that was also kind of interested in biology and was a fan of Darwin. Herbert Spencer was kind of a Darwin fanboy. And namely, what Herbert Spencer was really interested in was what we call like social Darwinism. He kind of took Darwin's ideas and spun them back into Malthus's ideas and said that basically, human populations kind of behave on a natural selection concept. But Herbert Spencer basically said that this was a summary of what Darwin's theory is all about. But the problem with this, and I want to dispel this right now, is this statement is kind of a logical fallacy. And the reason why it's a logical fallacy is because biological fitness in this case, fitness, doesn't mean like strong and fast. It's not like CrossFit fitness, where you can flip a tire over or whatever. Fitness in a biology context means to have more offspring. So a high fitness in biology, the term fitness in biology, literally means the individuals that have the most babies, that then go on to have the most babies or offspring. That is fitness. So fitness is reproductive success. So the idea is, if you live long enough to reproduce, you have a high fitness. So what we're basically saying is, if you live long enough to reproduce, you have basically fitness because you've survived. So when he said success, reproductive success. So essentially it's saying survival of those that survive to reproduce. And that's kind of like, isn't that like an obvious, isn't that kind of like what we call like a double positive? Or I guess the better way to say is this is a circular reasoning argument. It's what's called a tautology. And a tautology in philosophy or logic basically is a circular reasoning argument. And you know that among all the fallacies in that you can think of, a circular reasoning argument, which is technically called a tautology, is a fallacy, because you're basically using the word to define itself. Essentially, fitness means surviving long enough to reproduce. And so you're basically saying survival of those that survive to reproduce. That doesn't make any sense. So the term survival of the fittest, although when it was published, it people liked it. It was kind of sexy, right? It kind of was a very, very appealing way to say things. But it has been a very misleading and inaccurate way to describe natural selection, or how Darwin described natural selection. Darwin actually heard about this, but never would have liked it. But it could never be taken away from his association with Darwin. It was said by Herbert Spencer. This is probably the better way to describe what natural selection is systemic modification. So on the exam, be prepared to explain why survival of the fittest is not a good explanation for evolution. And the answer is, it's a tautology, or a circular reasoning argument, because fitness is not about strength or speed, it's about basically surviving to reproduce. Okay, we good? I know we went a little long in this, but that's okay. Let's go ahead and take a long 10-minute break, so at 9:30, give you a little bit more than 10 minutes. And I'm going to leave this on the board. I would recommend you use your cell phone, take a picture of it or make sure your notes are really accurate. Because on the exam, there will be like a timeline that resembles this, where I give you the locations, but I'll ask you to tell me what happened at each location, right? So like, I'll give you England, Cape Verde, Brazil, Chile, Galapagos, back to England, but you need to basically include kind of a general summary of what happened, including these books are really important to remember. That Darwin didn't operate in a vacuum, he had influences like Lyell and Malthus and different stocks. I'll also have a question about why survival of the fittest is not a appropriate explanation, and then I'll ask you to give me a better explanation, or better statement that describes natural selection, which is the second part. All right, sound good? Take a, again, 9:30, we'll get back together again, and then maybe go ahead and grab your the shells that were your bin here, and we're gonna work on the shells today.
Okay. I like them.